The massive hands that lifted Carol Morales from the muddy street were gentle despite their size, and as Alexander Alvarez carried her toward his cabin on the mountainside, she heard the cruel laughter of the townspeople fade behind them. Her wedding dress, torn and stained with mud and humiliation, clung to her trembling form as she buried her face against his broad chest, finally allowing the tears to fall freely. The man who had been nothing but a silent observer in the shadows had become her unexpected salvation, and though she did not yet understand why he had chosen to help her, she felt safer in his arms than she had in months. 3 months earlier, Carol had arrived in the small mountain town of Cedar Ridge with nothing but hope and the promise of marriage to a man she had never met. The correspondence marriage had seemed like her only escape from the poverty and judgment that had followed her since her parents' death. And Eugene Davis had written such kind letters, promising her a home and a future filled with respect and companionship. She had traveled by train and then by wagon for nearly 2 weeks to reach this remote settlement, her few belongings packed carefully in a single trunk, her heart filled with nervous anticipation for the new life that awaited her. The town itself was smaller than she had imagined, nestled in a valley between towering peaks that seemed to scrape the very clouds from the sky. Wooden buildings lined a single main street, their weathered facades speaking of harsh winters and the constant struggle against the elements that define life in this isolated place. The general store, the saloon, the small church with its modest bell tower, all seemed dwarfed by the magnificent wilderness that surrounded them, and Carol felt both awed and intimidated by the raw beauty of her new home. Eugene Davis had met her at the edge of town with a wagon and a smile that seemed genuine enough, though she noticed how his eyes lingered on her figure with an expression she could not quite read. He was a thin man with nervous hands and a voice that carried an edge of uncertainty, and as he helped her down from the mail wagon that had brought her the final miles of her journey, she felt the first stirring of doubt about the decision she had made. Still, she reminded herself that arranged marriages required patience and understanding, and she was determined to make the best of the situation that had brought her so far from everything she had known. The boarding house where Eugene had arranged for her to stay until their wedding was run by a sharp-faced woman named Susan Nelson, whose disapproving glances made Carol acutely aware of her size and the way her traveling dress strained across her full figure. The other residents of the boarding house were mostly single men who worked in the nearby mines or logging camps, and their stares ranged from curious to openly mocking as she made her way to her small room on the second floor. She had grown accustomed to such treatment over the years, but in this new place where she had hoped for a fresh start, the familiar sting of judgment felt particularly cruel. During her first week in Cedar Ridge, Carol tried to integrate herself into the community, visiting the general store and attending services at the small church where she and Eugene would soon be married. The townspeople were polite enough to her face, but she caught the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached, and she saw the way they looked at Eugene with expressions that mixed pity with amusement. It became clear that her intended husband had not been entirely honest about the nature of their arrangement, and that the town viewed their upcoming marriage as something of a spectacle. Eugene himself grew more distant as the wedding day approached, and Carol began to suspect that his motivations for seeking a mail-order bride had less to do with companionship than with some other need she did not yet understand. He would visit her at the boarding house in the evenings, sitting stiffly in the parlor, while making awkward conversation about the weather or the progress of the local mining operations. His nervous energy and the way his eyes darted toward the door suggested a man who was having second thoughts about the commitment he had made, and Carol felt her own anxiety growing with each passing day. It was during these uncertain days that she first noticed the mountain man who seemed to watch the town from the shadows. Alexander Alvarez was a figure of local legend, a man who lived alone in a cabin high on the mountainside and came down to Cedar Ridge only when necessary to trade furs or purchase supplies. He was enormous, standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed broad enough to carry the weight of the world. And his dark hair and beard gave him a wild appearance that made most people give him a wide berth when he walked down the main street. The children of the town would dare each other to get close to him when he made his rare appearances, but Alexander never seemed to notice their games, moving through the community with a quiet dignity that suggested he was comfortable with his role as an outsider. Carol found herself watching him from her window at the boarding house, noting the way he carried himself with confidence, despite the obvious discomfort his presence caused among the townspeople. There was something in his dark eyes that spoke of intelligence and depth, and she wondered what circumstances had led him to choose such a solitary existence. As her wedding day drew near, Carol began to hear more details about Eugene's financial situation and the debts that had apparently motivated his search for a wife. The whispered conversations she overheard suggested that he owed money to several prominent men in town, and that his marriage to her was somehow connected to a business arrangement that would help resolve his obligations. The realization that she was being used as a pawn in some larger scheme filled her with a growing sense of dread, but she felt trapped by her circumstances and unsure of what alternatives might be available to her. The morning of the wedding dawned gray and cold, with heavy clouds hanging low over the mountain peaks, and a bitter wind that seemed to cut through even the heaviest clothing. Carol, dressed in her mother's wedding gown, altered as best she could manage to fit her fuller figure, and tried to summon the courage to face whatever lay ahead. The dress had been beautiful once, made of ivory silk with delicate lace trim, but the years had yellowed the fabric slightly, and the alterations had left visible seams that spoke of the compromises she had been forced to make throughout her life. Susan Nelson had offered to help with her hair and makeup, but her assistance came with a constant stream of commentary about the unfortunate nature of the match and the gossip that was already circulating about what would happen after the ceremony. According to the boarding house keeper, Eugene's creditors expected him to use his new wife's domestic skills to help establish a more profitable household, and there were whispers about other arrangements that had been made to satisfy his outstanding debts. The small church was fuller than Carol had expected when she arrived for the ceremony, but she quickly realized that most of the attendees had come out of curiosity rather than celebration. The faces that turned toward her as she walked down the aisle were filled with barely concealed amusement, and she heard the soft laughter and whispered comments that followed her progress toward the altar, where Eugene waited with an expression of barely concealed panic. Reverend John Bailey, a kind man who had tried to counsel both bride and groom during the preceding weeks, began the ceremony with obvious reluctance, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty as he spoke the traditional words about marriage being an institution blessed by God and witnessed by the community. Eugene's responses were barely audible, and his hands shook visibly as he attempted to place the simple gold band on Carol's finger. The ring was too small, stopping at her knuckle, and the struggle to force it into place became an excruciating moment of public humiliation that seemed to last forever. It was then that James Anderson, one of Eugene's primary creditors, stood up in the back of the church and announced that he had information that would prevent the marriage from proceeding. His voice carried clearly through the small sanctuary as he declared that Eugene had already promised Carol's services to him in partial payment of an outstanding debt, and that the marriage ceremony was therefore fraudulent from the beginning. The revelation sent a wave of shocked murmurs through the congregation, and Carol felt the ground seem to shift beneath her feet as she realized the true extent of the deception that had brought her to this moment. Eugene's face went white as he stammered denials and explanations that only served to confirm the truth of Anderson's accusations. The details that emerged painted a picture of a man so desperate to escape his financial obligations that he had been willing to deceive an innocent woman and use her as collateral in his business dealings. The wedding guests began to laugh openly now, their amusement at the spectacle overriding any sense of propriety or compassion for the bride, who stood frozen at the altar in her ill-fitting gown. Carol felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in her cheeks as the laughter grew louder and more cruel. But this time it was accompanied by a rage that she had never experienced before. The months of hope and planning, the long journey to this remote place, the dreams of a new beginning, all of it had been based on lies and manipulation. She turned to face the congregation, her voice shaking with emotion, as she declared that she would not be party to any arrangement that treated her as property to be bartered and sold. Her defiant words only seemed to increase the amusement of the crowd, and someone in the back called out a crude comment about her size and her prospects for finding any other husband who would have her. The laughter that followed was like a physical blow, and Carol felt tears begin to stream down her face as she gathered up her skirts and ran from the church, pushing past the grinning faces and outstretched hands that seemed to reach for her from every direction. The main street of Cedar Ridge stretched before her like a gauntlet of shame as she stumbled away from the church, her heavy skirts making it difficult to move quickly over the uneven ground. Behind her, she could hear the continued laughter and commentary of the wedding guests who had spilled out onto the church steps to watch her retreat, their voices carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. The boarding house seemed impossibly far away, and she knew that even if she reached it, there would be no sanctuary there from the humiliation that would follow her for as long as she remained in this town. It was then that she slipped on a patch of mud left by the previous night's rain, her feet going out from under her as she fell heavily to the ground in front of the general store. Her wedding dress, already stained with tears and sweat, became caked with mud and dirt as she struggled to regain her footing. And the laughter from the crowd behind her reached a crescendo of cruelty that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. She felt utterly alone and defeated, abandoned by the man who had promised to marry her, and mocked by a community that saw her pain as entertainment. From somewhere in the crowd, she heard Eugene's voice raised in argument with James Anderson, their dispute over her future continuing, even as she lay in the mud like a discarded piece of property. The realization that they were still negotiating over her as if she had no say in her own fate filled her with a despair so complete that she could not even find the strength to stand. The weight of her circumstances, the isolation of her position, and the cruelty of her situation combined to crush her spirit in a way that no previous hardship had managed to accomplish. It was in this moment of absolute despair that she felt the strong hands lift her from the muddy street, and she looked up through her tears to see the face of Alexander Alvarez, looking down at her with an expression of such gentle concern that it took her breath away. He had appeared as if from nowhere, moving through the crowd with a quiet authority that caused even the loudest mockers to fall silent, and now he held her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. His dark eyes met hers for just a moment, and in that brief contact she saw a depth of understanding that spoke of his own experiences with judgment and rejection. Without a word to the stunned crowd, Alexander turned and began walking toward the edge of town, carrying Carol in his arms with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with his imposing appearance. She could hear Eugene calling after them, his voice shrill with panic as he realized that his bargaining chip was being removed from the equation, but Alexander paid no attention to the protests and demands that followed them up the mountain path. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, Carol felt safe, cradled against the chest of this mysterious man who had chosen to help her without asking for anything in return. The path to Alexander's cabin wound steeply up the mountainside, following a route that seemed to have been carved from the living rock by years of patient use. As they climbed higher, the sounds of the town faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of wind through the pine trees and the distant call of birds that nested in the high crags. Carol found herself relaxing against Alexander's chest, her body finally releasing the tension that had held her rigid throughout the ordeal in the church and its aftermath. His steady breathing and the rhythmic sound of his footsteps created a sense of peace that she had not experienced in months. The cabin, when it finally came into view, was larger and more substantial than she had expected, built from massive logs that spoke of both skill and permanence. It sat on a natural shelf of rock that provided a commanding view of the valley below, and she could see that considerable thought had gone into its placement and construction. A stone chimney rose from one end, with smoke curling lazily from its opening, and the windows were fitted with real glass that caught and reflected the afternoon light. This was not the rough shelter of a hermit, but the carefully crafted home of a man who valued both comfort and solitude. Alexander carried her across the threshold without ceremony, setting her gently on her feet in the main room of the cabin before stepping back to give her space to absorb her surroundings. The interior was as impressive as the exterior, with hand-hewn furniture that showed the same attention to detail as the building itself, and shelves lined with books that suggested an educated mind behind the wild appearance. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the warm air carried the sense of wood smoke and something that might have been stew cooking in a pot suspended over the flames. For several minutes, neither of them spoke, and Carol used the time to try to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. Less than an hour ago, she had been standing at an altar preparing to marry a man who had deceived her, and now she found herself in the home of a stranger who had rescued her from public humiliation without asking for any explanation or reward. The contrast was so stark that she wondered if she might be dreaming, but the warmth of the fire and the solid reality of the cabin around her confirmed that this was indeed happening. Alexander moved quietly around the room, adding wood to the fire and checking the contents of the cooking pot, his movements economical and purposeful in a way that spoke of long practice living alone. He was even larger than he had appeared from a distance, but there was nothing threatening in his manner, and Carol found herself studying his profile as he worked. His features were strong and weathered by years of outdoor living, but there was intelligence in his dark eyes and a gentleness in his hands that contradicted the fearsome reputation he carried in town. Finally, he turned to face her, and when he spoke, his voice was deeper than she had expected, with a slight accent that suggested origins far from these mountains. He told her simply that she was welcome to stay as long as she needed, that there was a spare room where she could rest and recover from the day's events, and that he expected nothing from her except that she treat his home with respect. The offer was made without conditions or expectations, and Carol felt tears begin to flow again, this time from gratitude rather than despair. She tried to thank him, to explain what had happened and why she had been in such a desperate situation, but Alexander raised a hand to stop her words. He told her that explanations could wait, that what mattered now was that she was safe and had time to decide what she wanted to do next. His matter-of-fact acceptance of her presence and his refusal to pry into her circumstances created a sense of sanctuary that she had never experienced before, and she felt some of the tension begin to leave her shoulders for the first time in weeks. The spare room he showed her was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered in handmade quilts and a window that looked out over the valley toward the distant peaks. He brought her a basin of warm water and some clean clothes that he said had belonged to his sister, who had visited the previous summer, and he assured her that she could have privacy to clean up and change out of her ruined wedding dress. The simple kindness of the gesture, after the cruelty she had experienced in town, nearly overwhelmed her with emotion. When she emerged from the room an hour later, wearing a simple dress that fit her much better than her own clothes ever had, she found Alexander preparing a meal at the large wooden table that dominated the main room. He had changed clothes as well, trading his town visiting outfit for the practical work clothes that seemed more natural on his large frame. And she noticed that his movements in the kitchen were as competent as everything else he did. The smell of the food made her realize that she had not eaten since early morning, and her stomach reminded her audibly of that fact. They ate in companionable silence, the simple meal of venison stew and fresh bread tasting better to Carol than any fancy dinner she had ever experienced. Alexander was not much of a conversationalist, but his presence across the table was comforting rather than awkward, and she found herself relaxing in a way that had seemed impossible just hours before. When he did speak, it was to ask practical questions about her comfort and needs, never prying into the personal details of her situation or demanding explanations for her presence in his home. As evening fell and the fire settled into glowing coals, Alexander finally began to share something of his own story, speaking in quiet tones about his decision to leave civilization behind and build a life in the mountains. He had been a teacher once, he told her, working in schools back east until a scandal involving a student's false accusations had destroyed his reputation and career. The parallels between his experience with unjust judgment and her own recent humiliation were not lost on either of them, and Carol felt a deep connection forming with this man who understood what it meant to be cast out by society. He had come west seeking solitude and a chance to rebuild his life away from the whispers and pointed fingers that had followed him, and he had found peace in the harsh beauty of the mountain wilderness. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge tolerated his presence because he was useful to them, trading furs and meat for the supplies he could not produce himself, but he had never sought their acceptance or friendship. His isolation was self-imposed and carefully maintained, a barrier against the kind of pain that human relationships could inflict. Carol found herself sharing her own story in return, telling him about the death of her parents and the poverty that had followed, about the correspondence with Eugene and her hopes for a new beginning in the West. She spoke about the loneliness of being judged for her appearance, about the way people seemed to think her size made her less deserving of kindness or respect, and about the crushing realization that Eugene had never seen her as anything more than a solution to his financial problems. Alexander listened without interruption, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he absorbed her words. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, as if considering his response carefully. Finally, he told her that he had watched her during her weeks in town, had seen how she carried herself with dignity despite the cruel treatment she received, and had admired her strength even before the events of the wedding day. His words were simple and direct, but they carried a weight of sincerity that made her heart race with an emotion she could not quite identify. The conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics ranging from books they had read, to dreams they had abandoned, to practical matters of survival in the wilderness. Carol discovered that Alexander was indeed well educated, with a quick mind and a dry sense of humor that emerged once he felt comfortable enough to let his guard down. She found herself laughing for the first time in months, and the sound seemed to surprise them both with its naturalness and joy. When she finally retired to her room, Carol lay awake for hours thinking about the extraordinary turn her life had taken. The man who had seemed so fearsome from a distance had revealed himself to be gentle and thoughtful, offering her sanctuary without expecting anything in return. She thought about the way he had lifted her from the mud with such care, about the quiet authority with which he had faced down the mocking crowd, and about the kindness he had shown her throughout the evening. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, she felt hopeful about her future. The next morning brought fresh snow and a howling wind that rattled the windows of the cabin, but inside the thick log walls, Carol felt warm and secure. Alexander had risen early to tend to his animals and check his traps, and she found herself alone in the main room, with a fire crackling cheerfully in the fireplace and the smell of coffee filling the air. She had slept better than she had in weeks, and she woke with a sense of energy and purpose that had been missing from her life for far too long. When Alexander returned from his morning chores, stamping snow from his boots and hanging his heavy coat by the door, he found Carol had prepared breakfast and was waiting for him with a shy smile. She had found his stores of supplies and had managed to create a meal that was both substantial and delicious, and she felt a sense of pride in being able to contribute something to their shared existence. He accepted her efforts with genuine gratitude, and she could see that he was pleased by her initiative and competence. Over the following days, they fell into a comfortable routine that felt as natural as if they had been living together for years. Carol took over the cooking and cleaning, tasks that she performed with skill and enthusiasm, while Alexander continued his work of trapping and hunting and maintaining the various systems that kept the cabin functioning. They worked together on projects like splitting wood and preserving meat, and Carol discovered that she was stronger and more capable than she had ever realized. The isolation that had seemed so daunting when viewed from town became a blessing when experienced from within the warm security of the cabin. The mountain wilderness was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also beautiful beyond description, and Carol found herself falling in love with the dramatic vistas and ever-changing moods of the high country. She learned to read the weather patterns and to appreciate the subtle signs that mark the passage of seasons in this elevated realm. As the weeks passed, the relationship between Carol and Alexander deepened from gratitude and mutual respect into something more profound and lasting. They discovered that they shared not only similar experiences of rejection and judgment, but also compatible temperaments and complementary skills that made them natural partners. Carol's warmth and humor balanced Alexander's serious nature, while his strength and competence provided her with the security she had always craved. They began to talk about the future in terms that included both of them, and the possibility of a permanent arrangement seemed to emerge naturally from their daily interactions. One evening, as they sat by the fire reading and enjoying the comfortable silence that had become precious to both of them, Alexander set aside his book and turned to face Carol with an expression of unusual seriousness. He told her that he had been thinking about their situation and that he wanted to make her a proposal that had nothing to do with financial arrangements or social expectations. He said that he had come to care for her deeply, that he valued her presence in his life more than he had thought possible, and that he would be honored if she would consider making their partnership permanent. His proposal was as different from Eugene's deceptive courtship as night from day, offered with complete honesty about his circumstances and his feelings, with no hidden agendas or ulterior motives. He told her that he could not offer her the social respectability or material comforts that might be available in town, but that he could promise her respect, loyalty, and a love that was based on genuine appreciation for who she was as a person. He made it clear that the choice was entirely hers, and that she would always have a place in his home regardless of her decision. Carol felt her heart swell with emotion as she listened to his words, recognizing in them the kind of honest affection she had dreamed of, but never dared to expect. She realized that somewhere in the process of sharing daily life with this remarkable man, she had fallen deeply in love with his strength, his gentleness, and his unwavering integrity. The future he offered might be unconventional by society's standards, but it promised the kind of happiness and fulfillment that she had never believed would be possible for someone like her. Her acceptance of his proposal was immediate and heartfelt, and they sealed their commitment to each other with a kiss that spoke of passion tempered by deep respect and understanding. They were married the following spring by a traveling preacher who asked no questions about their past or their unconventional courtship, and their wedding was attended only by the mountains and the sky and the wild creatures who shared their elevated domain. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge eventually learned of their marriage, and the news was met with the same mixture of amusement and disapproval that had greeted Carol's original arrival. But the opinions of people who had shown her nothing but cruelty no longer had the power to hurt her, and she found that she could think of their judgment with something approaching pity rather than pain. She had found her place in the world, and it was here in this cabin on the mountainside, with a man who loved her exactly as she was. Years later, when travelers occasionally made their way up the mountain path to trade with the mysterious couple who lived above the clouds, they would find a woman transformed by love and acceptance into someone radiant with confidence and joy. Carol had become an integral part of the mountain community of two, her skills in cooking, healing, and managing their isolated household making her an invaluable partner to the man who had rescued her from despair. Together, they had created a life that was rich in love and purpose, even if it was poor in material possessions and social recognition. The cruel laughter that had once echoed through the streets of Cedar Ridge was forgotten, replaced by the sound of genuine laughter shared between two people who had found in each other the acceptance and understanding that the world had denied them. Carol's sighs, which had once been a source of shame and mockery, became irrelevant in the context of a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Alexander's reputation as a fearsome hermit was transformed in her eyes into the protective strength of a man who would always stand between her and the cruelties of an unjust world. Their love story became a legend of sorts in the surrounding mountains, whispered around campfires and shared among the trappers and hunters who occasionally crossed their path. It was a tale that spoke to the possibility of redemption and second chances, of finding love in unexpected places and with unlikely people. Most importantly, it was a story about the power of genuine acceptance to transform lives and create happiness where none had seemed possible. The mountain man who had lifted the obese bride from the muddy street had given her far more than physical rescue from her immediate humiliation. He had offered her a new understanding of her own worth, a chance to discover strengths she had never known she possessed, and a love that celebrated rather than merely tolerated her differences. In return, she had brought warmth and joy into a life that had been marked by solitude and suspicion, proving that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can create the most lasting happiness. As the sun set behind the peaks that had witnessed their courtship and marriage, Carol and Alexander could look back on their life together with satisfaction and forward to their future with confidence. They had built something precious and enduring in their mountain sanctuary, a love that had grown stronger with each passing season, and a partnership that had weathered every storm. The town that had laughed at the obese bride had long since been forgotten, but the man who had lifted her to safety would remain her hero and her home for all the days of her life.